Welcome to Guardian Radio 96.9 FM Sunday, broadcasting from Nassau, Bahamas, and streaming live on GuardianTalkRadio.com, the country's news talk radio station with fresh news and smart talk all day. Our Sunday lineup begins with The Political Review with Quincy Parker, live at 4 p.m. That's followed by Let's Talk Together in English with Lady T, live at 6 p.m. Next comes the Sunday edition of Voices of the Diaspora with Robert Dudonné, live at 7 p.m. Followed by Caribbean and Urban American Gospel Hits with Landlord and Mike D at 8 p.m. That's all straight ahead, beginning with The Political Review, next, here on Guardian Radio 96.9 Sunday.
The views and opinions of the hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the position of the management and staff of Guardian Network. Welcome to the Political Review. My name is Quincy Parker, and I am your host on this wonderful Sunday afternoon. It is the 22nd of May, year of our Lord, 2022. And today we are going to have a fascinating conversation with one of my all-time favorite guests. And before we introduce our guest, I want to set the stage for our conversation. I want to circle back to the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow last year and point out that there were some key takeaways from COP26 that deal with progress made and areas that still need work in the fight to address climate change. And just as a, I guess, foundational statement before I talk about what happened and the outcomes of COP26, I want to point out, and this goes back a ways, I remember when I was a reporter during the Ingram administration, where the famous, I don't know if you guys remember, Earl DeVoe was the Minister for Environment. And Earl went to I think he went to the actual Paris climate change conference, which the famous Paris Agreement is reflective of. And one of the things that Earl DeVoe said when he came home talking about climate change was that the Bahamas was one of those nations that was seriously at risk if climate change continued unabated, and that the possibility existed that if the ocean temperatures rose by more than 2 degrees, the very distinct possibility existed that the Bahamas would, within 50 years, cease to exist, but the Bahamas would be underwater. In subsequent years, the target for limiting the rise in ocean temperature has come down from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees. And COP26 had it had a sense of urgency to it that I think is important to recall, especially for low-lying countries like the Bahamas. One of the main takeaways from COP26 is that the idea that public funding and private financing must connect. That is to say that financial institutions representing trillions of dollars have committed to tackle climate change, but getting that money to the right place remains a huge challenge. Also coming out of COP26, countries reached a deal on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which will govern international carbon markets and theoretically would ensure that emissions reductions are not double counted among countries. Another major outcome of COP26, a plethora of pledges to preserve or restore nature as part of addressing climate change. And those particularly the agreements on the issue of stopping deforestation garnered more attention at COP26 than in past years. Another outcome is the agreement that governments and private sector pledges are all well and good, but accountability needs to be strengthened. And finally, sort of the rounding out sort of the top 5 takeaways is this idea that while much of the focus on COP26 was on moving away from fossil fuels, emissions from the buildings sector remain a key challenge that have yet to be fully addressed at the government or even at the private sector level. And so what you have really is COP26 resulted in a raft of commitments, but there is still a sense of urgency around accountability. Because, I remember C.A. Smith said something to me one time, that paper is a very serious thing. People will lay down and let you write anything on it. But taking something from the stage of writing it down on paper to making it real requires political will, it requires money, it requires a number of things. One of the Bahamas's most voluble and loudest climate warriors has been the former Minister of Environment and former Member of Parliament for Marathon, Mr. Romauld Ferreira. Romy has been a climate warrior for any number of years, and he joins us today on the Political Review to have a discussion about climate change, the commitment of governments to addressing climate change, and other environmental concerns. Romy Ferreira, welcome to the Political Review. Welcome back to the Political Review.
It's good to be back. Thank you for having me.
So you've heard my opening statement. What are your thoughts on what I have said as far as context for our conversation today?
I think it's perfect. And so the only thing I would say further is that obviously from every government's perspective, climate change is real. And I've pointed out on a number of occasions, successive governments' commitment to it before we even had a party system of government. So this is something that has resonated with multiple generations of Bahamians. And that resonation, that thing that harmonizes with everyone, is this respect for the environment. And it has endured from the first marine sea park area that we call the Sea Gardens, created in the late 1800s, to present day. The real question is, as you put it in your opening, lots of money around the world is mobilizing towards climate change. It has been for a number of years. How do we access that money? Do our current structures serve us to do so? And of course, do we have the right framework and enforcement and political will ultimately to do the things necessary to achieve the goals that we all want, which is a country that will endure notwithstanding sea level rise and will do everything that it can to prevent its own self from being submerged, largely as a result of activities that are done by economic powers around the world. So I thought that you set the stage really well, and this is going to be a very fascinating discussion.
Well, you asked a couple of questions there that could be rhetorical, but I'd like to make those questions real. And I'd like to turn them around and ask you directly. Do you think, let's get started. Do you think our current structures, as you say, serve us in the way that is necessary, given the fact that we are a victim of climate change more than we are perpetrators of?
Yes, and of course, we are a victim of climate change. And when countries say that, and when we say that, what we mean is that our production of carbon dioxide and our production of methane is really negligible on the world stage. So therefore, as a country, we have the ability to sell the potential to develop our economy, because when we're really talking carbon credits, we're talking about economies, we're talking about development of economies. And we have that potential then to sell those credits. But the real question is then, do we have the structure? And this was something that we recognized early, certainly when I was minister. And this is the reason why you saw the rollout of the environmental legislation, because you cannot tap into any of that. You cannot tap into any of that unless you have the legislative framework. No government is going to give any government money without a legislative framework. And so up until we passed it in 2019, there was none. So there was none. And what they had certainly was inappropriate, and we could get to that, but there was really none. And so what you saw initially, certainly in terms of the legislative framework, was the rollout of the Ministry of Environment Act, and of course, the Environmental Planning and Protection Act. And these things are vital when it comes to climate change, because these allow governments mechanisms by way to receive potential donor funds, but also to enforce. You create a government mechanism to verify, which you were talking about, verifying the carbon credits, and to enforce if they're not met. So this was an important foundation. And then on the heels of that, we also introduced the ban on plastic, which a lot of people thought was esoteric, but it actually wasn't, because plastic comes out of the petroleum industry. It's a byproduct of their industry that they use to profit even more. So these things were part and parcel of fixing the landfill, which was also a huge source of carbon emissions, methane and carbon dioxide pouring out of the landfill with every fire. So this is the scenario and the framework and the backdrop that we inherited was one of a dump that was on fire and no legislative framework. What we sought to do and what we did was create a legislative framework and, of course, fix the dump. But one of the most important things that came out of that was this Access and Benefit Sharing Act. And the reason why I single this one out is because coming off of the heels of the Glasgow Convention, the government announced the climate change bill. And of course, they made a lot of hoorah about that. And in announcing that, I think the Attorney General went on record, and I hope I'm not quoting him wrong, I'm quoting him from The Guardian. He called it a poor excuse for legislative governance. And I thought that those comments were either taken out of context or perhaps he wasn't given the full perspective on what the situation is. The act that he is talking about, the Access Benefit Sharing Act, is a part of the environmental package that we brought in 2019. It was one of the last ones. But most importantly, what it does, it protects our natural resources from really genetic piracy, from people and entities and commercial entities in particular out there that understand the richness of our genetic resources, that understand that our marine biodiversity is the best in the Atlantic and among the best in the world, that understand, and this is of particular importance, that you can take multiple animals or plants of the same species from around the Caribbean, but when you analyze them on a genetic basis, the genetic richness of our marine natural resources far surpasses anything that our neighbors have to offer. I mean, it doesn't even come close, right? So you can take, for example, the famous example is the sea rod, for which a famous chemical company extracted an anti-aging ingredient. And they make money to this day. The Bahamas gets nothing. But let's stick with this example. So this particular sea rod, that's a common name, the richness of its genetic resources, the same species was recognized. And this is not just with this example, this is multiple examples in our marine richness and diversity. And they were able to extract from that a product that helps with anti-aging, but the government gets none of it. These are our genetic resources, by the way. These are our natural resources. So when all of the hullabaloo was going on about what are natural resources, well, we defined it. It's defined in the Environmental Planning and Protection Act. And so under that definition, these are our natural resources that other entities came, exploited, got the genetic information, and are making money. We are benefit zero. We had another very famous incident where a very famous a male potency and enhancement drug was able to use through our folklore and some of our bush medicine and extract compounds that facilitated that entity making a huge profit. And again, we made nothing. So we became very concerned because this is the reason for the act, but yet against this backdrop, you have legitimate scientists are trying to apply as well. And so his comments and this whole situation that is arising from this act are such that it causes us great concern, because are you really saying that you don't want Bahamians to benefit from their natural resources? Are you saying that you want companies to come in here and continue to plunder our genetic resources and nobody gets anything? I mean, surely that cannot be what he's saying. That's irrational. And so I'm calling for clarification on this point. He raised it in the context of the Access and Benefit Sharing Act, and it was coming out of the Climate Change Convention, and then they went on to announce the new Climate Change Act and regulations that they came up with that I went over in a great deal. But I think the most important thing is when we look at the sequence of events, it starts with the fact that we passed all of these laws that really create the foundation and the framework for whatever you see happening now. And any additional law is really just another ornament on the tree of the Ministry of Environment Act and the Environmental and Planning and Protection Act. But I am certainly opposed to the rollback of the Access, Benefit and Sharing Act because it disempowers Bahamian people. And so what we see the government doing is the vigorous application of this law against Bahamians. And this causes great concern for us because we know who the genetic pirates are. We know who the companies are. We know who the entities are. We know who the universities are that engage in their research and take their research grants. We know who they are. We also know who the Bahamian researchers are. We know them. We know who the Bahamian entities are. We know the entities that mean our country well. And so to apply this act, the Access, Benefit, and Sharing Act, against Bahamians in the same manner in which you that you propose not to apply it against the big chemical companies and beauty companies is perverse to us. And so this is a big part of the discussion that I would certainly like to delve into. Also, coming out of the climate change bill, I went over the legislation, and there's some key points that I think certainly need to be raised, and they're nuanced points, because to put this into context, having a climate change act is very important. So let's not, I don't want to undervalue this important step. But what I would like to say on this particular step in relation to the Climate Change Act and regulation is that when you look at the framework of this particular bill, it is set up to buy carbon credits, and it is set up in such a way that the government appoints the board. Now, if you remember correctly, that several ministers of the government went to an African country, I think it was Benin. I'm not sure if I'm correct, but I believe it was Benin. And what they went there to do was to observe the carbon credit system between the government of Norway and that government in relation to preserving its forests. Mm-hmm. And then they touted the fact that we can make, there's the potential to make money off of our natural resources because you can just preserve the forest or preserve the coral reef or preserve the mangrove, preserve something that is analogous to a carbon sink, similar to a carbon sink in a Bahamas situation. Obviously, we don't have an equatorial rainforest. But that situation is like all situations there. The government of Norway gives that money into an entity that is not controlled by the government, that is actually controlled by the other donor nations. And they, along with the United Nations, determine the projects. That is the way it is done in terms of those type of entities that receive carbon credits worldwide. We had a similar incident in the Bahamas with the Bahamas Protected Areas Trust Fund, which is a very similar thing. As a matter of fact, it is the precursor of all of this. And the reason why I call it the precursor is because it is a fund that, when we say fund to your listeners, all that means is that it attracts monies from international donors that goes into a bank account by which the Bahamas can access that money. And that money is used directly to protect marine protected areas. So what we were able to do was pass 43 marine protected areas right at the end of my tenure, certainly, which built on the original work and took our protected areas to 20%. What that does, it's the same concept as coming out of Benin in terms of the carbon credits. It's the same concept because you're preserving marine areas, a carbon sink, and you're able to access money. But one of the problems with that is that if you have a government-controlled board, like in the climate change bill that the government just passed, it cannot receive the money because those international donors, certainly the European Development Bank, the German Development Bank, obviously the government of Norway, as they indicated in Benin, various federal departments in the United States, they don't give monies on carbon credits to government-controlled boards. And this was the same battle that we had when we came to power, because when the previous administration set up the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund, they also made it a government-controlled board. And by doing that, that fund was unable to attract the kind of funds it needed, particularly from the German Development Bank. So I know this is very technical, but this is a very important point. If you set up the fund in such a way that it cannot attract the funds because it ab initio, then it's just smoke and mirrors. And unfortunately, there's a lot of that in there. And it won't be as effective as they're touting. And this is coming on the heels of a criticism of a piece of legislation that really protects the interests of all Bahamians and protects our natural resources. and as part of a multi-fabric, multi-layered, well-thought-of environmental rubric. And so this led to this discussion today. And what we see here is the enforcement of environmental regulations against Bahamian researchers by a government entity, well-known Bahamian researchers that can't get a permit. And then you see on the other hand, where the environmental impact assessment regulations, which we all work together in the climate change unit to produce, the whole team of us, we see that a permit that's issued under that for development in Exuma that says no excavation, the government won't enforce those regulations. And so what we're seeing coming to bear is a sort of bifurcation with the same old rhetoric. Exuberant enforcement of laws against Bahamian entities and turning a blind eye against, non-Bahamian. So as to me, this is more NIGOD-esque than anything else.
All right, I want to try to, at the risk of calling names and pointing fingers, one of the things that I would like to try and do is bring some clarity to the specifics, right? You are charging that the government is using the Access and Benefit Sharing Act against Bahamians. How specifically is the Davis administration using that legislation against Bahamians?
Correct. Because they're aware that there are Bahamian research groups operating in the Bahamas legitimately that are desirous for permits, and those permits are governed under that same bit of legislation. They're aware of that. They could very simply make a carve-out. When I say carve-out, they can say that if you're a Bahamian research group, we will give you these permits. So what am I really saying? They are aware that when I say Bahamian research groups, I'm not just talking about, I'm talking about Bahamian colleges and universities that are here, like University of the Bahamas, that are affiliated with foreign colleges and universities. I'm talking about legitimate institutions of higher learning, like in Bimini and South Eleuthera, and there are various ones of them in San Salvador that have been in the Bahamas for years and that apply for permits. I'm talking about universities that have been doing research in the Bahamas for years, decades, and apply for permits. You have that, and then in the midst of that, you have what I determined, or what I said at the first instance, what we call the commercial researchers, that their applications are more for commercial basis, anti-aging, anti-cancer, erectile dysfunction, the list goes on and on, high blood pressure, the whole 9 yards. And so you already have this scenario. And so what's happening under this administration is that they are applying the rules to the commercial prospectors with the same enthusiasm as they are to the Bahamian researchers. And that is the salient point, that is not, certainly not the intention and ought not to be the intention of the act, certainly not to disempower, because what you're talking about is a plethora also of Bahamians themselves that are doing degrees in natural science. So this is something that can be readily addressed and fixed. But against that backdrop, this is the point I'm making, against that backdrop, against a backdrop where you have an Access and Benefit Sharing Act that is designed to protect our natural resources from foreigners and from foreign institutions where the Bahamians don't get any benefit, but those rules are being applied against Bahamian researchers, right? You have that backdrop. And then you have another backdrop where you have the EIA regulations that have been passed, that we passed along with the Ministry of Environment Act, that says that all development has to submit to an environmental impact assessment. And it issues permits under those same regulations. And there's a permit that's issued for development in Exuma. And the permit says no excavation, but the people are excavating. And so what you have is a classic example of the duality of existence that happens here, where you have Bahamians really having the full weight and measure of the law being brought against them. when a simple carve-out could be effective, and you have a non-Bahamian entity that ought to conduct themselves in a certain way as in accordance with the permit, and they're not. And so, yes, this is exactly the point I'm raising.
Okay, so let me ask you, just let's pull back a little bit and ask just for some establishment of common grounds here. What other countries have legislation like the Access and Benefits Sharing Act?
Just about all developing countries around the world have some analogous ones, although we were the first in the Caribbean. Because the Access and Benefit Sharing Act, remember that this wasn't created in a vacuum. This was created out of a recognized need and vulnerability that was unique to the Bahamian economy. Remember, I prefaced everything by talking about our natural resources. And I know it's very topical. We talk about our natural resources. We had an exciting discussion on whether or not we had oil. I think I even discussed that with you. We had people even talking about whether or not we have gold, and all of this stuff. But here's what we do know we have. In the Bahamas, our marine resources, the genetic diversity of our marine resources is the richest in the world, certainly the richest in the Caribbean by far. This is something that we know we have. And this is something that everybody else knows. And so the design and purpose of the Access and Benefit Sharing Act is to prevent the loss of revenue to the Treasury because it's happened before. So this was identified as a risk to our economy. So this doesn't just materialize out of the woodwork. This was on the basis of study and examination and evaluation and, of course, consultation.
Right, and you raised the point that I'm trying to get to, right? Which is there is an economic component to this that, and this is the argument that I hear, is that the Treasury is losing money because people are taking our patrimony and making money off of it without giving us any, any benefit in their profits. Are there other countries that make the kind of arrangement that you're talking about, or is this something that we are inventing?
No, I mean, other countries have access to the benefit from their genetic resources. This is fairly common. But I think what I want to emphasize is that other countries in the Caribbean don't have this opportunity because their genetic resources, to be blunt, just aren't as rich. It's just not as worthwhile. This is the place to be when it comes to genetic prospecting in the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. This is the place to be. So we are particularly vulnerable. It's kind of like, when we switch the argument to aragonite, right? It's kind of like when we switch the argument to aragonite, we're always going to be particularly vulnerable to aragonite because we're one of the few places, if not the only places, where you can find aragonite. So it is because of the uniqueness of that is inherent in our natural resources that some of this legislation is driven, and the Access and Benefit Sharing Act is one of them. So, right. So these things are. And this is why, though, I hope I'm explaining it, and I'll try my best to explain it as best I can. But this is why I want to emphasize the fact that the reason why they are here is because they recognize that. The reason why we had to pass the legislation is because we have already lost millions and millions of dollars by not having this legislation. And what this legislation does is that the next anti-cancer drug they find, the next anti-aging drug that they find, and it comes from our waters, it comes from our animals, the next flu medicine that they find, and it comes from our traditional knowledge, the next piece of bush medicine that they find that cures whatever ailment, as long as it comes from our traditional knowledge or our seas or our forests, we get to benefit from that. And that wasn't there before. And we've lost tens of millions of dollars because it wasn't there. So the idea is to get that because you want to regulate that element of it. But then at the same time, you also want to permit legitimate researchers to do their work. And I'm saying that that balance isn't there and that Bahamian researchers are being treated unjustly. And at the same time, the government is turning a blind eye to foreigners that are doing far worse things. That is exactly what I'm saying. And this is coming on the heels of the government touting their climate change bill, saying that the Access and Benefit Sharing Act was a poor excuse for legislative governments. And I don't know what the Attorney General meant by that, but I'd love to talk to him and find out in debate form. But what I would say is that hopefully he doesn't mean that enforcement of the laws to the benefit of Bahamians to protect our natural resources. I mean, he couldn't possibly mean that. And he couldn't possibly mean any of the other stuff. But here's what I'm saying is that this law is being applied unjustly against Bahamians and that the EIA regulations are not being enforced against non-Bahamians. That is exactly what I'm saying.
Okay. And so that's, I'm sorry, that just seems incredibly unfair. And it also seems to go against the rhetoric of the administration. So this is why I'm asking it, because I just want to make sure that we're not talking at cross purposes and that we're not misunderstanding what is happening. So you're saying, and I guess I just want to make sure that my listeners understand clearly as well, that the argument is that Bahamian researchers are being disadvantaged versus foreign researchers by the application of the Access and Benefits Sharing Act by the Davis administration right now in this present moment.
Yes.
That's insane, bro.
So
that's insane.
Well, what is interesting to me is that this is coming out of the heels of the climate change agreement, the Glasgow Agreement. And I think you laid out the rules quite clearly. And I thought I took a note and I thought it was quite interesting because at the beginning you said getting the money to the right places remains a challenge. And you see, that's always the challenge with climate change. That's the challenge with any environmental legislation, getting the money to the right sources. So we have a bill here, the Access Benefit Sharing Act, that potentially will get money to the Treasury. Then we have the Climate Change Act that they promulgated that is intended to get money to the Treasury. All these things are intended to get the money in. Those researchers are willing to pay, the Bahamian researchers are willing to pay their research permits fees as well. I mean, they're willing to pay them. And remember that the EIA regulations that you don't enforce is also a loss in fees. So at the end of the day, we have perhaps the forerunner and the best and certainly the foundation of any kind of environmental legislation that we've ever had before. We have a Ministry of Environment Act. We have an Environmental Planning and Protection Act. We have a Plastic Pollution Act. We have Access and Benefit, all of that. All of that relies on the political will of enforcement and to determine how all of that is played out. And it's an organic process. And so what we're calling on here is for leveling of the playing field for Bahamian entities and a calling to account for anyone that feels compelled to not follow our environmental legislation. And that's one aspect of it. And when we get into the climate change discussion on the act itself, we can talk about the structure of that bill and whether or not we think it will attract or get the money to the right place. But certainly what we've seen so far on the environment front, there's a lot of bluster and a lot of blister, but nothing really new. And nothing really new. We don't even see the enforcement of the existing laws that we left in place. And this is the point I'm making. The laws that are in place that can be enforced. I mean, we don't even see the enforcement of that. And then when we do see that, we see the enforcement to the detriment of Bahamians. And that surely can't be right. And it's not right. And so it's a duty to speak out against that. But certainly when you see them announce that on the heels of a climate change legislation that has that structure, it really makes me wonder.
Okay. I want to park that discussion for just a few minutes. And I wanted to ask you, I mean, I know you long time, and one of the things that I remember most clearly about your interest in public life was the need for environmental planning and protection. And I remember your early interest in the regulations that were not initially present to give teeth to our environmental legislation that existed at the time. Now that we have that you have passed this raft of environmental legislation that contains definitions that talks about enforcement and whatnot, the new administration has brought to us a bill on climate change, and I want to get your thoughts on that legislation. What do you think of that legislation as it is currently formatted?
I think it's a good first step. And so by all means, I congratulate any government that passes environmental laws, because ultimately I want more of them, more and more and more. But I would say certainly, so congratulations on that end. But as an ecologist, right, I've been practicing and conducting environmental impact assessments in this country. I did my first one in 1992. I've been doing it a very long time. I've been a regional consultant drafting international environmental laws. I've done, my goodness, tons of work in the region and all of that. And so the technical part of me has concerns. And so while I like it as a step in the right direction, right, I would be remiss if the part of me that understands all the nuances, that understands the flow of getting the money to the right places, that understands what it takes, that you have no double counting in carbon dioxide, that really understands how to collect those pledges and the plethora of pledges that you talked about. The technical part of me has, some deep concerns. And those concerns have to do with the structure of the receiving entity that's going to get the money. Because everything in environment devolves on who receives the money. And this is the reason why in the Ministry of Environment bill, we created entities to receive money on behalf of the government. And those are entities that receive money on behalf of the government that are controlled or have their directors appointed by the government. So when they say the government controls that entity, they just mean the directors are appointed. But with this climate change bill that you see, that board is controlled by the government. And then that government appoints a management agency. The mechanism by which, on how they appoint that management agency is not in the legislation. So it remains out there, in Plato's world of ideal forms, and it's yet to crystallize into this particular part of reality. So we don't know what the criteria will be in selecting this, or any of that information. We just know that they will select one. And we know that there will be a board. But this board will be, as I keep emphasizing, will be majority controlled by the government. The reason why that's a problem is because when you have a board set up that way, that's majority controlled by the government, you do not get the funding. You do not attract the funds because the donor agencies, the entities that actually are going to pay you for the carbon credits. And the big example of this is when the Minister of Environment went to Benin. I think he went along with the Minister of Works. And they were touting an example down there between the government of Benin and I think Norway, the Norwegian government. When that government was being paid a certain amount of money to preserve the rainforest, to preserve that. And of course, that is true. You can go online and look at it, but that money isn't paid directly to any government control board as is set up here. We have a government control board set up here to receive that money and give it to a directing agency. That's paid into a fund controlled by the donor agencies. And then the UN et al. Selects the projects. Here is not set up like that. Here we're very hands-on on the money, and we've seen this example before. You see, I have the benefit of having drafted the Bahamas Protected Areas Trust Fund legislation. We've seen this example before. And in doing that, in going through that process, we know that if the government control board, you won't attract the funding. You certainly wouldn't get it from the government of Norway. You wouldn't get it from the German Development Bank. And there are a plethora of other agencies, particularly out of Europe and some federal agencies that you just won't get it from because of the structure of it. And we know this. They know this because they were present when we were in Parliament and amended the Bahamas Protected Areas Trust Fund. And that was the justification. So what am I saying? We have an existing mechanism that can receive money now. We know what that mechanism looks like. This particular piece of legislation is a duplication of it, but it certainly cannot achieve its result in its current form because it's a government-controlled board and that doesn't attract the funding. And that is a fundamental point in relation to this piece of legislation. Notwithstanding, we're talking climate change, and that's always a good thing in a Bahamas situation. Because let's face it, we're in the front lines of a climate change war.
Talk to us about enforcement. That is one of the areas in which all the commentary around COP26, it all lands basically on this sense. Anything that you say is good, but enforcement is the key. And so you have the raft of legislation that was passed under your CHOP, and now you have new legislation that's being introduced. What are our enforcement options?
Enforcement is important. It's very important. And one of the things we did was get the environmental court back up and running, so we could deal with enforcement, certainly at the magisterial level. It's very important. Important that this enforcement at every level is actually important. But remember now, we want to enforce the law equally against all when it comes to environmental infractions, right? Not to disadvantage one group over another, but to apply it equally. So enforcement happens at three levels in this country: at the magistrate court level, and Supreme Court and Court of Appeal, and finally the Privy Council. I mean, those are the mechanisms of enforcement. And so what we were able to do is get the magistrate court up and running to deal with the less complicated methods of enforcement. But when you're talking carbon credits, and when you're talking about enforcement at that level, and when you're talking about enforcement within the parameters of an international treaty, public international law, you're talking about a different creature, because you need not only enforcement at one level in terms of your state and national entity that's doing the enforcement. That enforcement itself, in some instances, needs to be verified in order to benefit from it. And so when we talk about enforcement, we have the magistrate court level, we have the Supreme Court level, where you'll see issues like judicial reviews play out. That's where what's happening now with the development I was talking about in Exuma, where there's an environmental impact assessment permit that says no excavation, and they're excavating right now, or were, in Staniel Key. Those are elements of enforcement. That's Supreme Court level. And of course, that could potentially play out to the Privy Council. But when you're talking about in the climate change context, when you're talking about international agreements, they're looking for enforcement and some sort of verification in a lot of instances. And that's very important because that is how you're going to get that is how you're going to ensure that the money gets to the right sources and places. I mean, that is the challenge. The challenge is in the details. So enforcement is very important, but it's not a one sort of size fits all. It certainly depends on what you're looking at. So it's multi-level and multi-tiered.
Do we have the political will in place, in your view, to make enforcement of this legislation and any legislation around climate change, around the environment, particularly when it comes to things like, as you're talking about, developments that are happening at the instance of foreign direct investment or developers who are outside the country?
I think we do. I think sometimes we have to all work together because it's a partnership. The government relies on us sometimes to nudge them in the right direction so they can do what they ought to do. So I think we do have the political will to do it. And I'm calling on the government to do exactly that. But what I'd like to see happen, though, is let's take a look at this climate change bill. Let's take a real look at this because our futures literally depend on this. We have to get this right. I mean, you said it, you gave a very sobering introduction, and it's all true. One day, a lot of Bahamians believe that how climate change is going to work is one day you're going to wake up and everyone's going to be underwater. But what's going to happen is one day you'll have a flooding event and the water just won't go away. Each time it'll get higher and higher and higher. And you're seeing it happening now. I mean, even the skeptics are convinced. So it's important. It is important that we get this legislation right. It is important that we learn from our mistakes in the past and do not repeat them. It's important that we build on what we have. And it is of supreme importance that we apply the law equally. As Montesquieu, these are some of the tenets of English law as set forth by Montesquieu. The equal application of the law. And that's for your legal listeners. But this is very important. And so as we roll out these regulations, which I believe every government wants to apply, we have to remember that we have to apply them equally. And this issue with climate change is not going to go anywhere. We have to get the funding. Why do we need the funding? To repair our bridges, repair our seawalls, restore our mangroves. We need access to the funding. But if we do it in this particular manner, where the government controls the board, that's just smoke and mirrors. We won't get the funding. You can quote me on that every day, all day. We just simply won't get the funding with that structure. And if we continue to apply environmental regulations to the detriment of Bahamians and then not enforce them, when clearly the permit, I mean, I saw this permit. The permit clearly says no excavation. I mean, clearly, that's not the way forward. The way forward is harmonious enforcement of these laws and regulations that everybody has to comply with. Not one group of people or another group of people, everybody. And everybody has their respective space within the legislative framework that suits them. So Bahamians have their space, non-Bahamians have their space, and everybody is applying in harmony. I mean, that is the correct approach on enforcement.
So one of the things that I've always been curious about, when you look around the Bahamas National Trust and the National Park Service, you have park wardens who are, all of the ones I've met are really brilliant people who dearly love what they're doing and are very knowledgeable about the parks for which they care. But they are also one person responsible for oversight of, acres upon acres upon acres of land and sea heritage. So when I ask about enforcement, I'm not talking necessarily about Well, I mean, obviously the courts, yes. But I guess I'm asking whether or not, in your view, we need something like environmental police or an environmental defense force or something along those lines.
It's hard. I mean, when you talk about enforcement, to me, you have to break that down into what we're looking at or what we're considering to be enforced.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, we already have the equivalent of environmental police that consists in the Department of Environmental Health Services and also officers from the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection Act, which sort of have oversight, and that's your first line of offense. Provided the nature of the complaint isn't criminal, then that's when the police kicks in. So, I mean, we already have. The thing is we don't have an environmental enforcement agency that is a one-stop shop that charges, prosecutes, and convicts. I mean, all the way to the end. It involves the interplay of multiple government agencies. I mean, that's the structure that we have now. So on the seas, that enforcement is the Royal Bahamas Defense Force. In criminal matters on land, that is the Royal Bahamas Police Force. And they do participate and they do excellent work in enforcing our environmental regulations. They're really the first line of attack. And Customs, the Department of Customs. I mean, when you're talking about enforcing the ban on plastics, I mean, they were on the front lines. So enforcement from a government perspective involves multi-agency cooperation. And in some cases, it would be a waste of funds to duplicate that effort, because you find yourself duplicating it and not getting the desired results. So inherently, it involves cooperation between government agencies.
Yeah. I floated it because I remember a conversation that we had in the newsroom on one occasion about how enforcement and expertise work together. Right? The idea that in order to truly have an effective enforcement regime, the individuals responsible have to be expert, or at very least very knowledgeable in regards to the arena in which they are supposed to be enacting their enforcement activities. And that's why I asked, because there was a view that you need to have some level of environmental expertise, or at least familiarity with the environmental regulations, in order to effectively police environmental activities around the country. And that's I guess that is the genesis of that question and that expectation that do our police know? Do our Defense Force agents, our officers, and customs agents know this law well enough to be able to protect our rights in that regard?
I would say yes. When it comes to enforcement, I keep emphasizing it just depends on what we're talking about, and it's also it's so multi-institutional. But normally, when you have the new bits of legislation, or new pieces of legislation introduced, the enforcement agencies that are going to be affected, I mean, those are the first people that you'd call in. But when you look at environmental regulations and enforcement, right? Because environment really deals with so much and everything, that is so multi-layered. If you have violation of fisheries, for example, somebody has undersized crawfish, then, obviously fisheries and the Defense Force and all of that come into play. When you're talking about somebody, for example, putting up a development and not complying with the requisite environmental rules, then that moves out of the hands of fisheries and that lands square into the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection. When you look at somebody who wants to come in and do genetic research on our marine biodiversity, I mean, that's not fisheries that's dealing with that, that's looking at that. That's the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection. But when you move into another realm, say like public waste, sanitation, oil spill remediation, and some elements of that, then all of a sudden you move into another government agency, which is the Department of Environmental Health Services. And amidst all of that, you always have the police, defense force, and customs playing a role, because they are critical, certainly for certain types of confrontations with the public. So it's always interagency. The subject matter of what caused the infraction really determines what the lead government agency would be. The police and customs and defense force, they support everybody. So, I mean, that certainly was my experience. But depending on what that infraction is, I tried to use those examples of whether it's fishing regulations or maybe it's a permit, maybe you have a development in the wrong place. All of these things attract different levels of expertise from within government at different levels and different layers. And it's all there. I mean, there's a cadre of people that are certainly well trained.
Yeah.
That are there.
Yeah, and I don't want to give the impression that we are slamming on our law enforcement agencies or the courts. As I say, it was just something that I was curious about because of that particular discussion, and I thought that you having sat in the chair and being the passionate environmentalist that you are, that you might have an interesting perspective on it. So folks, it's 5 o'clock. You're listening to Guardian Talk Radio. My name is Quincy Parker. This is The Political Review, and we're chatting with former Minister of the Environment, longtime ecologist and chemist, also attorney at law, lion power himself, Don Quixote, my boy, the great and terrible Romauld Ferreira. And we're talking about not only the new climate change legislation, but the whole gamut of motivations and intentions around how to address climate change, how to address our environmental patrimony, how to deal with the natural resources in a way that benefits Bahamians at large. I'm going to go back to the climate change question and COP26 in a bit, Romy, because I have one more set of questions about that. But I wanted to ask, in regards of the benefit sharing that we're talking about. So we are I want you to tell us what the legislation imagines in terms of how benefits are supposed to flow back to the Treasury and the country at large from whatever is happening with regard to exploitation of our natural resources.
Thank you for that question. The Act itself contemplates a type of sovereign wealth fund. So we call it a sovereign wealth fund, but it contemplates that. And so this is how it works. Remember what I mentioned to you, that there was a beauty company, I believe it was Revlon. Mm-hmm. They found this anti-aging miracle ingredient that is derived from our genetic resources. So the way how you receive that is by way of royalty, by way of copyright, trademark, and intellectual property. Because the reason why you will be entitled to it is because, remember I mentioned that there's a certain type of sea whip that contains these anti-aging ingredients. When scientists take specimens from that sea whip, they analyze the genetic sequence, the arrangement of the nucleic acids of that animal. Once they figure that out and they link that to the genetic code for anti-aging, they can then reproduce it in a lab. They then understand what those chemicals are, the relative proportions of them, and then they can make them synthetically. Once that happens, it now becomes a commercial venture. So up to that point, it'll be research. They'll just be looking at this animal, looking at it, oh, it lives forever, or it does really well. But once they get it, and they do that by way of genetic markers. So that's all done in a lab. Once they get that, it becomes a commercial entity. But because that genetic sequence comes from an animal within the Bahamas, then we are entitled to some of those royalties. And as I said at the very beginning, that has happened before, and we did not get. We're not talking about insignificant amounts of royalties here. We're talking about billions here. So this isn't normally when I hear these discussions on the radio about our natural resources, I hear them talk about aragonite and billions, and I already know the world market for calcium carbonate, so I'm suspicious. I hear them talk about oil. I hear all of that. But this is something that is very real and happening now. This isn't about to happen. This is very real and happening now. And it's the same thing with our bush medicine, believe it or not. They have found drugs to aid in erectile dysfunction from our folklore and from our bush medicine, and we do not get any of those royalties. So this is what I'm talking about. This is the mechanism by which the Treasury will get the money. Because each time you buy one of those products, whether you go to a cosmetic store or you go to the pharmacy to get whatever, each time, and right now, we know that they're very close to an anti-cancer drug right now with marine animals from our waters. So we're on the verge of this right now. This is happening right now. This is live science. This is very live science happening right now. And if we dismantle that, we will never get that money. That would mean that every time that anti-cancer drug is dispensed, you'll get nothing. Just like every time that anti-aging cream is sold, you get nothing. I mean, that's not acceptable, okay? That is not acceptable, not in the modern Bahamas. Not knowing what we know, that's not acceptable. And all of this because you want to apply the rules unjustly against Bahamians. I mean, that's ridiculous. So what I'm saying here is that is so to clear that up, that's the mechanism by which you get the money. There's a sovereign wealth fund in there that pays the money into the Treasury, and then the government is free to dispense of it. And this isn't a fanciful one. I got to emphasize that. This isn't like oil. We've never found oil in this country. We've had natural seeps. We've never found it, right? It's speculation. This isn't like aragonite, let me say that, where we all know the cost of calcium carbonate. Aragonite is a source of calcium carbonate. That's all it is, a source of calcium carbonate. We know the world market for calcium carbonate. I understand that. This has nothing to do with that, right? This isn't like gold where people are talking about maybe we have gold. We don't. We don't have alluvial deposits. Let me clear that up. What we do have is the richest genetic resources in the world when it comes to our marine diversity. And we've lost money because of it. And what we need to do is capture that money. And that's all I'm saying here. And this is a very real situation that's happening right now. It's just unique to the Bahamas, and it's because of the richness of our marine resources.
So, okay. So we'll circle back to that in a few minutes. But I want to make sure that I get to some of this climate change stuff, because there's a sense that I have, as someone who's reported on it, about the kind of urgency that is necessary to get anything done. And I can tell you no lie, Romy. I don't know if I feel no urgency. You know what I'm saying? So 200 nations nearly agreed for the first time to phase down unabated coal-fired power plants and most fossil fuel subsidies, while pledging to submit more ambitious emission reductions targets just a year from last November. And this is contained in the 11-page Glasgow Climate Pact, which also adds pressure on nations to quickly ramp up efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions this decade. That's the 2010s. It hopes of limiting the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. By adopting the pact, they might be able to keep a narrow window open for meeting the most ambitious goal of the landmark 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change. That's an unprecedented deal that was reached last November. And the president of COP26, Alex Sharma, said, and I'm going to quote him, because I think what he said was fascinating. I said, together over the past 2 weeks, parties have demonstrated what the world had come to doubt, that countries can rise above their differences to unite against a common challenge. I think today we can say with credibility that we have kept 1.5 degrees within reach, but its pulse is weak, and it will only survive if we keep our promises and translate our commitments into rapid action. The Bahamas is, as we've already established, not a producer or a significant producer of greenhouse gases or greenhouse gas emissions. And yet we are among the first that will more or less pay the heaviest price for global temperature rise beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade. I am of the view that a part of the beach erosion that we're seeing now is not just development driven, but because the effects of climate change are already being felt. Romy, you're an expert. You can tell me if I'm wrong on that. But it seems like, in addition to whatever advocacy we can undertake on the international stage, is there nothing that we as a low-lying developing country or a low-lying state can do to increase the speed with which the world responds to the climate change crisis?
Yeah. Without a doubt, we're on the front lines of climate change. And I think everybody is aware of that. And it's because we're so flat. Our country is really just a plateau emerging out of the Atlantic Ocean. By plateau, just one, big flat basin. So we're essentially flat. We don't produce the carbon dioxide, but I think the most significant take-home point is for your listeners is that when we're talking about reducing carbon dioxide, for a lot of economies, what you're talking about is a reduction in growth and expansion. And so unless those trade-offs are right to the countries that want to expand their economies, like India and China, versus some of the European countries that have already expanded their economies. So there's always that dialogue. Fundamentally, you're talking about economics, you're talking about money. But this is an important debate because what you're really seeing taking place is the effects of human activity on the planet. And that in itself, that took a while for people to come to terms with. But here's a great example of it. I don't know if you remember that there was a hole in the ozone layer some time back. I don't know if you remember. And they signed the Montreal Protocol. And the hole in the ozone had to do with chlorofluorochemicals that were put into the aerosols to make them spray. And scientists in the 50s discovered this hole in the ozone. And of course, there was great concern. The Montreal Protocol was signed. Countries banned it. I mean, it took a while, but countries banned it. And as a result, the hole in the ozone is now closing. So there have been success stories based on environmental treaties. That is the classic example. They are hoping that the climate change agreement, most recently the Paris Accord, would be another example of that. But getting the nuances right on the economy is certainly important. But getting the nuances right for us as a developing nation is going to be different. And so the reason why I mention that is that as a developing nation, our strategy is different. We're not trying to develop a manufacturing industry, for example, produce steel or smelt iron or refine other raw materials. We have a tourism product. India and China are doing those things and are growing their economies. The more mature economies are to a different phase. Our strategy, in order to benefit from that, is and has always been to have the effective kind of legislative framework that will benefit from the monies that are happening. Because in order for these countries to expand their economies under these climate change agreements, in order for the countries that want to expand their economies, want to build more factories, want to build more coal-fired plants, want to build more power stations that are not renewable energy, in order for them to do that, right? Under this agreement, they have to buy carbon credits from countries like the Bahamas that have them for sale. But in order to buy those carbon credits, there has to be an existing legal framework for those countries to buy them. And that existing legal framework is validated by the United Nations Environment Program in part and other agencies. And that existing legal framework by which the money goes to the right places mandates that the receiving entity is not a government-controlled board. And this is why we raised the concerns right at the very beginning, because you won't be able to benefit from it. So in other words, as these companies pay other countries like Benin in Africa, because theirs isn't set up that way, as they start to pay other countries for their carbon credits, they won't pay us because our structure is wrong. And we know this to be wrong. That's why we amended the Bahamas Protected Areas Trust Fund in 2019, because we know straight up that that particular structure will not attract the money. And so we will not get the funding. The only benefit we get out of these accords is funding. That's what we get, so that we don't have to spend our money on capital, climate resiliency change projects. And I hinted at them, repairing docks, repairing bridges, repairing coastal roads. The whole of the Bahamas is a coast. We're all coastal roads. And so that is really our only benefit. And it is therefore critical and imperative that that structure be correct. And this is why we're right back at that same point.
So, all right, okay. I need you to help me with something, Romy. I'm not an idiot, and I don't think the people who are sitting in the chair of government at the moment are idiots. So, what you have explained seems eminently reasonable to me. That if the structure that is proposed is even just by its nature, incompatible with the billions that will flow or are flowing, why use that structure as opposed to one that is compatible? I don't understand.
Well, neither do I, particularly as we have the structure already. It exists in the form as the Bahamas Protected Areas Trust Fund Amendment Act. We have the structure, but this isn't unknown. This is the way how it works worldwide. If you want to access the money that is flowing from carbon credits, this is how you have to set up the entity. This is nothing new. So what we're seeing here is a little bit of defiance, because this is the way things are done worldwide. This is really nothing new. So it's a little bit surprising to see it that way. But we're saying that needs to be amended. But most importantly, though, I think that when we're talking climate change, you have to put the country in the position to benefit from the funds that flow from climate change. And they are flowing now. And when you go to the international conferences, everybody is trying to benefit from the flow of money. As these countries seek to expand their economies on carbon, they seek to buy credits. The only way we can do that is through the kinds of laws that will permit these entities to give us the money. And if that's not in place, then we won't get it. We won't benefit. And that would be, that's just a shame, because we stand to lose the most.
That just don't make no sense to me, man. All right. So hopefully the Ryan the Lion is listening and will be able to give us an explanation, the benefit of his wisdom and thinking as to why structure that seems incompatible from the beginning with the global system is being contemplated when the appropriate structure already exists.
I think those points were raised in Parliament as well. So, I mean, those points were raised. And it's an important discussion to be had, because what you really amount to is wasting time. You're not going to have access to it, so that's time lost. But if he has a rationale by which he can explain it, which perhaps he does, then we need to hear it. So we need to hear the rationale for that. Why would it be structured that way? Why would you not want to have access to these funds? Why, knowing what you know, with the stance of the German Development Bank and the strong stance that they took in terms of giving monies under those kinds of structures? You know, what will be the arrangement of the management company? How do you go about selecting a management company to negotiate the natural resources on behalf of all Bahamians? I mean, that is a mammoth task. There's nothing in the legislation that says how they will go about negotiating that. Who will qualify? How will they go about being qualified? Who will make that final decision? Remember now, this is a private company that is negotiating the natural resources of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. There's nothing in the legislation that says how that will be appointed, how they will be fired, what the terms and conditions with. All of that is shrouded in secrecy. That is as mysterious and secretive as just about anything else. But it can't be, because you're dealing with the natural resources of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. We all need to understand what the nature of that relationship is going to be. We all need to understand, like, how will you select these people? We need to understand that. Not only that, the donor agencies need to understand that. They're not just going to take your word for it. They're not just going to say, oh yeah, you're a good guy, which we know you are. You're going to have to show that through structure and transparency. And so we want to see it. If it's truly transparent, one of the tests of objective reasoning and transparency is that it can stand up to objective scrutiny and reason. So we'd like to see it. It begs the question. We'd like to hear the rationale as to why would you repeal an act that protects the natural resources versus just make it easier for Bahamians to apply. I'd like to hear that rationale. Or I'd like to hear the rationale as to why would your department issue an environmental permit and your department seek not to enforce it. Your own permit, the terms of the permit that you issue. You issue your permit. It says no excavation, big Stanley Key development, and they're excavating. Why would you not enforce that? I would love to hear the explanations to all of this, because consistency is part of it. So yes, I think there's a rationale that he may have. I would encourage him to share it with us all.
I mean, he has to have a rationale. You don't do anything. You don't just act. Action comes from motivation. There's definitely something going on. We just need clarity
Yes.
and an understanding as to what it is. This is kind of an odd question, but you're an odd fella like me, so I think we can have this discussion. The Bahamas. Okay. Before I ask that, can you explain simply what are carbon credits?
Okay, before I go any further, I'm not an odd fellow on Scottish Constitution. The carbon credits. I can resist that now. It's a little sense of humor. But yes, carbon credits.
I understand.
Carbon credits are essentially just what they say. That's really money that other countries pay to really developed countries pay to developing countries for use of their carbon credits. So what does that mean? That means every country has a quota of carbon that they can actually use within this framework that you were talking about to achieve this 1.5 degrees Celsius. Mm-hmm. Under that system, some countries have more carbon and some countries have less. And so those with less trade with those countries that have more, like the Bahamas. And that's called trading in carbon credits. And that has a value. That has a dollar value. That's traded on the stock exchange. That's a real live living quantity. But it's a unique type of trading in as much as the way how this is set up, countries do it. So when we think about stock trading, we tend to think about individuals buying shares, but countries do this. And so because countries do it, and countries are run by elected governments, and elected governments carry varying degrees of transparency, corruption indices, and effectiveness all around. This is a global phenomenon. There are built-in safeguards. One of those built-in safeguards is that the receiving entity for this money is not a government-controlled entity. That is an important safeguard. That is like the first level of safeguard that they have. And so that's why it defies reason. And that's why we have to discuss it. We want to understand, how do you propose to make this climate change bill effective, notwithstanding the structure is not conducive to receiving the money?
Mm-hmm. Right. So with that backdrop and against the entire discussion that we've had, what responsibility does the Bahamas have to take actions that mitigate climate change effects? For instance, we have a power system that is entirely dependent, well, not entirely, but majority dependent on fossil fuel. And there has been for decades call after call after call after call for, you got to inculcate renewable, you got to make more, you got to do more renewable, we got to get solar, we got to get ocean power, we got to yada yada, so on and so forth. And for all of the talk, we continue to find ourselves in bed with fossil fuel. And renewable energy always seems to be just out of reach. Now, I have some thoughts, having worked at the power company for a while, about why it is out of reach, but that's a different discussion. Should we as a country be held to account for continuing our reliance on fossil fuels when we are chastising and castigating larger countries and bigger economies for the same thing?
I mean, that is a question of environmental ethics right there. And the answer to that is we have to do our part. And you hit the nail on the head with that, because what you're really saying is this: we're going to the world community and we're saying that we have carbon credits. We're saying that they're for sale. We're saying that this is the legislation under which we're going to sell them, right? And of course, we stand to benefit from it. And notwithstanding the criticisms, I made against the legislation, it still exists and we can amend it. But at the same time, equity requires clean hands. It's a famous legal saying. But what does that mean? Is that, well, it really means that countries are going to be looking to see that you're doing whatever it is possible for you to do to make yourself less dependent on fossil fuels. The problem we have isn't a unique problem to us, is that the Bahamas Power and Light is a fossil fuel company. And they are charged with, introducing renewables. So fundamentally, there's a fundamental problem going on right there. Whereas a fossil fuel company that produces most of its power by fossil fuels is responsible for renewable energy penetration. But that being the government setup, that's fairly common. But when it comes to renewable energies, distributed generation is the way to go for this country. Certainly in the Family Island situation, it's going to be Probably more challenging in the New Providence because of, well, space. 1 megawatt is equal to 5 acres. Once you apply that little rule of thumb, 5 to 8 acres in a New Providence setting, you see where the challenges lie. But integrated distribution for New Providence is essential. Rooftops, public spaces, and you saw that taking place. We solarized the QE Sports Center, first of its kind in the region, 1 megawatt. BPL tied it into the grill. So BPL has made great advances in this area. They've come a long way. Nobody's probably satisfied, including the officials at BPL, as to how far they've come. They probably all want to go further. There's new leadership there. I think they understand the need and they're sensitive to it. They're challenged by an aging grid and, of course, capital costs. So this is one of those things where we all have to work together. And we saw it starting to play out. BPL had made a commitment towards imposing certain renewable energies, but definitely the Ministry of Environment was playing its role in getting grant funding. And again, because of that experience in getting grant funding for the Ministry of Environment to then implement these various functions, this is how I know and how we have experience in the way structures ought to be set up to receive that grant funding. So we're always going to be challenged by that. The key is to have a different strategy for New Providence versus the various family islands. And I think that is in place. It's hindered by capital investment. But what you're beginning to see happen, and certainly what we put in place, is the requirement on foreign direct investment to have a significant renewable energy component. 30%, as I think, was the cap. So as we roll in new foreign direct investment, and as long as this particular iteration of government doesn't change that requirement of 30% renewable energies, that would mean then foreign direct investment coming in must add 30% by RE to the grid. I mean, that is very significant right there. In taking demand off of BEC to produce energy, it makes that much more energy available for other consumers. So there's a benefit there. So we're going to see it play out in that way. And we'll also see monies, if we can attract the monies from the climate change bill. I mean, these are what these things go to pay for, RE systems. And this is why getting it right is so critical, because the climate change money that comes in, and I said it at the very, very beginning, the donor agencies tend to want to see that used for climate change type projects, climate change type resiliency projects. And renewable energy is one of them. Solar panels is one of them. Wind is one of them. And it's a natural system for getting the money to the right sources. And as you mentioned, that's a perennial challenge. It still is. But this is why it comes back to this climate change bill, because that's the way you're going to do it.
So to paint a context picture, I did some research, and the International Energy Agency says that global oil demand alone would need to collapse by 75% over the next 30 years in order to put the world on a pathway to net zero emissions by 2050. At the same time, solar, wind, and other renewable energy sources would need to increase more than 5-fold, and nuclear power would need to double to shrink fossil fuel share of the global energy mix from 80% to 20% by 2050. Now, of course, the IAEA sees this window of opportunity to hit this pathway narrowing very quickly as global demand for oil and gas rebounds from the low point of the 2020 pandemic lockdowns. But the record and the furor over record gas prices in Europe last October only fueled the debate over whether the pace of energy transition is already crippling energy security, setting the world up for damaging price volatility in the years to come. So basically what you have is, despite calls for the need to double down on renewable spending to avoid a supply crunch such as that seen in the gas markets, major challenges to backstopping intermittent renewables with baseload power capacity still remain. And in a country like the Bahamas, where we have a spending crunch that means that we cannot move wholesale into inculcating renewables into our energy mix, we find ourselves stymied as to a path forward. So the door of the millions and billions of dollars that's flowing through the international financial system for the express purpose of promoting renewables, we have to throw that door wide open so that we as a jurisdiction can benefit from that as much as possible. Eh?
Yeah.
And if the government is closing that door by incorrectly or by inappropriately, let me not use the term correct, by inappropriately structuring bits and pieces of the legislation and its government infrastructure, there's a problem there. And someone needs to say what the benefit of doing it this way is as opposed to doing it the way it's already done in the current legislation.
There are two things that jump at me. We mentioned this about the fact that we want to attract money through the climate change bill, and the structure is wrong. But there's another component. What we don't have is the liberalization of the sector. So what you don't have an IRCA, because we have IRCA, but what you don't have is IRCA giving out generational licenses or distributional licenses to other entities to produce electricity from renewable sources. What you have is a climate of protection for BPL, because as a state-owned monopoly, the government has so much money tied up in just loans to BPL and covering their debt that there's a protectionist environment. And they fear, and we all fear, that without that environment, BPL would just fold. We all work there. I work there as well. It's not sustainable financially, certainly the model they have. They can't pay their bills. The fact of the matter is that it is a state-owned entity. Decommissioning that's another discussion. But setting it up so that we have greater renewable penetration, that's entirely possible. And the Family Islands, is that spot. And so the private-public partnership between BPL and between people that want to put in systems in the Family Islands, put in these, and we saw it happening sort of post-Dorian, put in these distributed renewable systems along stretches of the Abaco Highway and et cetera, where it all plays out. This is the way to go. It would be through public-private partnership, because it's the only way that it's certainly a very good way to attract the capital that they need to put in the infrastructure. Because in order to put in the infrastructure, you need not just solar panels, you need to upgrade the distribution and generation system as well. So you have to attract that capital. That either is going to come from more state borrowing, or that's going to come from private sources. If it's coming from private sources, that's public-private partnership. So the question is, how open is BPL to that? Do you see a structure on their website saying how to do that if you want to generate for them? They're very very protectionist. You don't see any sort of licensing scheme emerge like you see beginning to take place in the radio sector, radio broadcasting sector, or in the telephone sector. You don't see any of that. Or even shades of it in the water and sanitation sector. You don't see that yet in power generation. So that's an interesting observation. So I guess what I'm hinting at is structurally they're not even, they don't seem to have contemplated that to its full extent.
What is hilarious about what you are saying is that BPL had a, have mercy. I am no longer with BPL, so I do not want to be identified as carrying water for BPL. But I have to tell the truth. And the truth is that BPL had a strategic plan that was commissioned by the old board that was written after a tremendous amount of research by the executives of the company, and a part of that strategic plan was it called for exactly the kind of licensing of power distribution that you're talking about. So it is actually incorrect to say that they had not contemplated it. What is more correct is to say that prior to the opportunity to implement that aspect of the strategic plan, things changed.
Okay.
Whether or not the current board is minded to continue with the use of the strategic plan that was, in my view, responsible for reducing outages. I mean, it's not even in my view. I can pull up the numbers to show you. The plan was working. Whether the board continues with it is up for debate. Obviously, it's highly unlikely because we know that with politics and with a new board, that means that whatever the old guys were doing is going to get put on the shelf. And we're going to go through all this trouble of doing another strategic plan and starting again from scratch, even though there was something there to build on. So there's my few minutes on behalf of BPL.
I'm glad you cleared that up because that's very important. A differentiated licensing scheme will open up power generation, really will open the whole industry up. And that's the competition that Bahamians are really crying for. What they're really crying for is to have another provider. And what you find, particularly when it comes to power, and this isn't just something in the Bahamas, this is in the US as well, particularly in take California. When it comes to power, you tend only to have one provider, and that provider tends to be a monopoly, and we see it playing out here. But the way around that is the differentiated licensing scheme, where licenses are issued and, of course, or under some sort of public-private partnership agreement. I mean, that's definitely the way.
Yeah, the plan was very simple. I mean, the former chairman of BPL, Dr. Donovan Moxie, said it any number of times in the public. He said that BPL wanted to get out of the business of power generation. And the way that BPL had intended to do that, according to the strategic plan, was to license private companies to do the power generation and leave BPL to deal with customer service and maintaining the grid. You know what I'm saying? So this was the plan. I hope that they continue in that direction. I doubt they will, but I hope they do.
Maintenance, holding on to the grid is really, that's the number one asset.
Yeah.
The generation, obviously, that's important. It's better done by private hands. I certainly agree with that. But maintenance of the grid, I mean, that's basically the brains of the operation. So it's a good plan.
You cut the generation. You give that to the private sector, and for whoever says that they want to see renewable generation, well, invest in it. As long as you sell us enough power to keep the customer satisfied, we don't care where the power comes from. Our job is customer service and the grid maintenance.
Yes.
Our job is power generation. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
To me, that's the ideal model, but who knows? I just reach. Romy, one of the things that I wanted to ask you, the Minnis administration suffered from a preponderance of news about Hubert Minnis and not enough news about what was being done by the administration and in the different ministries. That's my view, right? Dr. Minnis was a lightning rod for the news reporters for whatever reason. And of course, he has very dedicated supporters who love him dearly and who go to war for him at the drop of a hat. And so I don't want anyone to think that I'm attacking Dr. Minnis, because I really didn't come in for me. But there was a view that I have the view that so much happened that was not noticed or not paid attention to in the administration that set such that, in my view, some of these things were historic. And one of those things, and I continue to talk about it, is the amazing package of legislation that you passed in the Ministry of Environment. And so with the last few minutes we have on the show, I wanted to ask you why that legislation was important. And I want you to give us specific examples, because I think people don't understand the value of the legislation, and they don't understand it because when it was passed, the legislation was overshadowed by the politics of dealing with Dr. Minnis as a prime minister, as opposed to actually understanding why this legislation was historic.
So the best way to look at it, how I look at it, is that up until 2019, there was no environmental legislation. What we were operating with were a bunch of laws that were scattered all over the place. And the most important one, and still is a very important bit of legislation, was the Department of Health Services Act, which established the Department of Environmental Health Services. But there was none. So what does this mean, though? Why is it important? Well, we didn't have a Ministry of Environment Act. So there was no legal entity by which countries wanting to make donations to the Bahamas and make it to the Ministry of Environment, there's no legal entity for them to do that. But the most important thing, there was no lawful entity by which the Minister of Environment can act, because he wasn't represented in law. And that is very significant, because you didn't even have the most basic and elementary framework of any kind of environmental legislation. And then in order to deal with that effectively, obviously you have to have an agency. You have to have an agency to enforce these new environmental regulations, which are all contained in the Environmental Planning and Protection Act. And the Environmental Planning and Protection Act is a significant piece of legislation because it sets out modern environmental laws with modern fining abilities. So what does that mean? That means in the past we had companies coming here, and if they break our environmental laws, the fines were so inconsequential that it didn't serve any kind of prohibition. And there was no agency supervising that. So we corrected all of that by introducing an Environmental Planning and Protection Act. And then we tackled the ethics element of it that you mentioned, which has to do with, well, if you're going to solicit climate change funds, you must do everything that's possible and within your capacity to reduce your emissions. And this is why you saw the landfill being fixed, which is a public-private partnership, because that's the source of emissions. This is why you saw the control of plastic, because controlling plastics is controlling our source of emissions. And you mentioned at the beginning that we don't produce a lot of carbon dioxide, but per capita, we're some of the highest producers of, or was certainly, plastic pollution. Not just us, the entire Caribbean. So you see us starting to tackle that. So all of this is starting to putting us in good stead. And then we passed and enacted 43 additional marine protected parks. That's 43 areas that we could potentially benefit from under this Climate Change Act, because they are carbon sinks. They are places where the carbon dioxide goes. So these bits of legislation were historic. When you talk about the protection of plants, all of a sudden mangroves become protected. They weren't protected before. All of a sudden sea oats, everything's under the same act, the schedule under the Plant Protection Act. So everything becomes consolidated, everything becomes transparent. What developers have to do then become transparent. We passed the environmental impact assessment regulations. So gone are the old days when developers coming in, you didn't know what you had to do. Now you know you have to do an environmental impact assessment and you have to get a permit. But as we've said at the very beginning, it's important to enforce those regulations equally. So we cannot countenance the situation in Exuma where a permit is being violated. We cannot countenance the situation where Bahamians are being disenfranchised. So this is a bastardization of the legislation. But the most significant thing is now you have the framework upon which to act. It absolutely did not exist before. It simply wasn't there. They talked about it, but they never did it. I worked on, over the course of my career, I started looking at draft environmental legislation back in 2004. There were bits of it floating around. Nobody ever did anything with it. We formalized it, made it world-class, and passed it to protect the natural resources of the Bahamas for the Bahamian people. And that's the difference right there.
All right. What's next? What needs to happen now? How do we, as a country, as a jurisdiction, how do we move forward? And how does, in addition to saying what's next and how we move forward, how does the official opposition help the government move forward so that the country moves forward as a whole?
Well, what's next? Well, that's obviously what's next is we need more environmental laws. There are a ton load of them out there. There's some we left on the drawing board. Certainly I did. There are two that are very critical when you talk about what's next. One is this environmental damage, this whole idea of environmental damage, which has to do with when a ship is at berth and it loses its anchorage for some reason and it slams into a reef. How do you assess that? You know, that whole idea. And the other is cruise ship regulations. Cruise ship regulations for when they are in port. It's an important source of revenue. And of course, the cruise ship industry is a high impact industry. I mean, there's nothing environmentally friendly about them. And so they need to be regulated. And so those regulations are there. So when you ask what's next to be done, those two, along with the Mining Act, which brings clarity and transparency to all mining operations in the Bahamas, those are all on the table and they have to be brought forward underneath this rubric. And of course, to amend this Climate Change Act so that we can actually get the funds. You know, so but when you talk about what's next, as you see the rollout of these various cruise ship industry installations throughout the Bahamas, those cruise ship regulations that we left in place, is going to be critical that those are enacted. They form an important part of the regulatory framework that needs to be done to monitor and preserve the environment. A very important part, and they need to be enacted without delay.
Is it your view that let me rephrase, from what you can see, is the Davis administration on a path to take those next steps that you deem are necessary?
If I would say the answer to that, will they do it? I would say no. And here's my justification. Because what you've seen so far, what I've seen so far from them, doesn't encourage me to think otherwise. We have environmental legislation in place that they're in. I mean, this is the scenario that the landscape that I see. We left laws in place. Those laws aren't being enforced. The ones that are being enforced to the detriment of Bahamians. When people complain, you enact a climate change bill that is not in keeping with industry practices and will not achieve your intended purpose of attracting the funds. So it shows a willingness to talk a lot about a subject, but not a willingness to give it the requisite level of thought and contemplation that goes into effective action that's going to make a difference. And that's the level of concern right there.
And so if you had the ear of the minister, the ear of the prime minister, the ear of the attorney general, and you had a few minutes to say what you had to say to them, what would you say?
I want to encourage them to put the politics aside and to build on what already exists, to not make the space not work for Bahamians, but to apply the rules effectively against all and to follow the law. If there's a rationale in your thinking, then come to the Bahamian public and explain it. Explain what you've put down on paper. But there are always going to be
really can help you right quickly
people in your community
you never have to
that know about the subject. Whatever piece of legislation that you're going to bring to Parliament, it doesn't matter who the legislator is or what party it is. There's always going to be a group of people in the public that are going to know a lot about that subject matter, and it's going to be, you may be able to present legislation in such ways, and those questions aren't raised. But when you come by people that are much more learned in the subject matter, they're going to notice it. And you have to actually justify that element to the ones that are in the know, because it's a part of the reasoned debate, it's a part of a democratic system, right? It is the purpose of Parliament. But the purpose of Parliament is for reasoned debate. I mean, this is the democratic model that we inherit and that we all follow. And that was handed to us. It's the colonial model. And it calls for reasoned debate where you present your ideas, and those ideas have to stand up to certain scrutiny. And this is a very nuanced debate, because on the face of it, you can say to everyone you have a climate change bill. You can say that on the face of it. But it's only when you look deeper. It's only when you look deeper with the understanding of what the intent of the bill is and the mischief that it's trying to cure. And the mischief that it's trying to cure is that we are not getting any money for our carbon credits. And will it cure it? No, because it's not structured correctly. And threatening to dismantle laws and legislation that actually protect the natural resources for the benefit of the Bahamian people, that's not the way to go about it. And that's what I would say. I would respectfully suggest about face.
All right. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us, Romauld Ferreira. We believe that the powers that be are listening. They will have heard our very reasoned and sensible discussion. And I believe that people of goodwill will make the right choice for the country that we all share together. Thank you very much for joining us again on the Political Review. I give you the floor if you have any last thoughts you'd like to share.
Just thank you for having me, and have a wonderful Sunday evening.
Yes, indeed. Oh, I suppose I should ask this, given that this is the Political Review. Are you still open to frontline politics?
Yes, without a doubt.
Without a doubt.
There'd be no
you plan to. You said you plan to run in the next race, whenever that might be.
Yes, I plan to, and I support my leader. I support the leader of our party wholeheartedly. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Then I guess that means we'll be looking for you in the long run. We'll have you back, I'm sure, between now and then many times. Romauld Ferreira, thank you for your time. Folks, that's going to do it for us here on the Political Review this Sunday. Go forth and love your families, and we will see you next week. Take care. God bless.